Hello and welcome to week 3 in database systems. Our agenda for this conversation is that first we'll talk a bit about the assignments, and then we'll talk a little bit about chapter 6 and chapter 8. Those two discussions will be in separate videos, primarily because of the length involved. So we'll split those into basically for this week 3 different things. First off, your assignments. In week 3, you're to read chapters 6 and chapters 8, which we'll also be discussing here briefly. Chapter 6 centers on basic SQL concepts and terminology and syntax. Chapter 8 centers on relational algebra and relational calculus. Discussion 1 is about chapter 6 and SQL, and it is due by the end of week 3 at essentially midnight. The second discussion for this week is around chapter 8, which talks about relational algebra and calculus, again, due at the end of this week. And also, we're coming up on the first course project, which is 200 points out of the total 1,000 points, and it is due the last day of week 5 at midnight, roughly. So you probably want to get a good start on that sooner than later. Moving on to week 3's objectives. In chapter 6, we talk about SQL, basically data definition and data types, the specific constraints, how you specify constraints inside of SQL, basic SQL retrieval queries, inserts, updates, deletes inside of SQL, and some additional functionality available to you in SQL. Chapter 8 is around relational algebra, unary relational operations, relational algebra operations from set theory, binary relational operations, and some additional relational operations as well, along with some examples of queries in relational algebra. Relational calculus, we talk a little bit about tuple relational calculus and domain relational calculus. And then we give kind of an example database application using the company, and then perhaps a brief discussion of QBE language, although I may skip over that for brevity's sake. Chapter 6's discussion, the first discussion in week 3, is to talk about how can keys and foreign key constraints be enforced by the database management system. Is the enforcement technique you suggest difficult to implement? Can the constraint checks be executed in an efficient manner when updates are applied against the data set or the database? So basically respond to that prompt in 250 to 300 words, making sure that you additionally respond to 2 of your classmates along the way as well. Make sure that you're adding to their conversations in a substantial sort of way. The second discussion for this week, chapter 8, is around what is the function operation, what is it used for, and present a practical example or scenario where it might be used. Again, 250 to 300 words. Make sure that you do respond to 2 of your classmates. Make sure that your first post is by Wednesday, roughly at midnight. And then make sure that you engage actively in the discussion and build upon conversations. The course project for the first phase is around basically getting MySQL up and running and being able to answer a few questions. There is an example video that you probably want to watch, but the deliverables are basically a set of select statements which answer the queries which we'll discuss in a moment. You'll also want to include a Word document that is named appropriately as well. So the first step is to download and install MySQL Database by Oracle. Follow the step-by-step instructions and so on. Once you've done so, you want to create a database and actually make sure you follow the instructions and install as defined in instructions to install MySQL PDF. Once you've done so, create a MySQL database in the attached video and essentially download the project PH script MySQL file that is attached. Then run that file against your instance of the database and then create the queries that answer the questions that are asked on the next page. But basically that script is going to be populating your data for you. So the queries that you're to answer, there are 10 of them. So write a SQL statement that produces the output as follows: the student's first name and last name, and so on. So make sure you do each one of those, documenting them to where it's very clear to see what query is being done by, what SQL is going with which query, and so on, so that it's very clear for someone to understand what it is you've accomplished. And then the rubric is as follows, and the rubrics will be followed very closely. As always, if you have any questions about this material, do let me know. That's what I'm here for. Stay safe, and we'll speak again next week.